Desperate, Russia plays its trump card. At 0438 hours local time, a MiG-31 Foxhound streaks across the Sea of Azov, its nose pointed north of Crimea. Still just miles offshore from Russian territory, the jet releases its payload, a Kinzhal hypersonic missile. The weapon detaches, its rocket engine igniting as it climbs toward the stratosphere. Once touted as a game-changing missile, the Kinzhal was feared until it started facing Patriot air defenses in Ukraine. Despite Russian boasts, the Kinzhal is little more than an air-launched ballistic missile, traveling a predictable flight path, and so far Patriot batteries have made a habit of swatting them out of the sky. That's why today's mission is targeting a stretch of the front lines over 150 miles from the nearest known Patriot battery. For the past week, Russian forces have pushed forward, carving out a small bulge in central eastern Ukraine. Now a Kinzhal missile is screaming toward this pocket at Mach 10, closing the distance in seconds. At this range, even if a Patriot battery fired, the missile would already be at its target before interception. One of the few real advantages to the much-hyped Kinzhal. Almost 2 minutes later, the Kinzhal plunges toward its pre-programmed target, but this time it's different. The missile detonates mid-air, hundreds of feet above the ground, and in an instant it becomes immediately clear this is no ordinary attack. A fireball erupts, stretching hundreds of feet across and towering nearly 1,000 feet into the sky. The explosion is so intense that any Russian or Ukrainian troops unlucky enough to be looking its way are temporarily blinded, their retinas seared by the sudden burst of light. Thermal and night vision systems on both sides flicker and burn out, leaving the battlefield in chaos for miles around. The intense heat is instantly lethal within several hundred feet, incinerating everything in its radius. The missile's target was closer to Ukrainian-held territory, but the shockwave doesn't discriminate. The concussive blast tears through a Russian trench, killing several soldiers on impact. Any trees still standing in this moon-cratered no-man's land are shattered apart, their splintered remains joining a violent cloud of debris. Blasting outward at several meters per second, the debris moves fast enough to kill anything up to 1.5 miles from the detonation site. Despite the size of the explosion, casualties are relatively light on both sides. That's largely thanks to the trenches and underground bunkers most men have spent the last 2 years living in. But this wasn't a strike meant to win a battle. It was a statement, a declaration to the world from a resurgent, emboldened Russia. If you think this scenario is fiction, think again. Even now, Russia is mulling using the freedom it's discovered after America removed its boot from its neck to launch just such an attack. In late 2022, the Russian Federation had just suffered a massive, humiliating reversal as Ukrainian forces retook significant chunks of the country. It was later revealed that nuclear tensions were so high at the time that President Biden intervened, pressuring Ukraine to hold back its forces and allow Russian troops to escape from the Kherson region. On the verge of a decisive victory, one that could have led to the capture or destruction of up to 30,000 Russian soldiers, Ukrainian forces were ordered to stand down. Instead of a devastating blow to Russia, the Kremlin's troops were given safe passage across the Dnipro River, taking all their equipment with them, a retreat but not a rout. President Biden feared that such a catastrophic Russian defeat could push Putin to the brink, forcing him to make good on his nuclear threats. At the end of the day, we can armchair quarterback all we want, but we don't have access to the intelligence that the president did at the time. What is known, however, is that Russia's nuclear rhetoric escalated rapidly around this period. Behind closed doors, even China and India, Russia's key strategic partners, reportedly issued private warnings to Putin, urging him not to cross the nuclear line. America, too, had sent a stern warning, with then Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin personally warning his Russian counterpart about the consequences of such an act. The details of the conversation remain unknown, but intelligence suggests that the U.S. delivered a stark warning. If Russia launched a nuclear weapon, the first response would be to eliminate the unit responsible for the strike. If attacks continued, the U.S. would escalate further, declaring open season on all Russian forces inside Ukraine. It's unknown what would have happened if things escalated further from there. However, what we do know is that Putin never ended up using a nuclear weapon, and we might be about to find out if that was due to America's threats or not. 2025 is a world away from 2022 and 2023, with Russia facing a significantly more difficult battlefield today. For months, Russia has waged a campaign where it's seen as many as 2,000 or more casualties a day. Most analysts believe that Russia was deliberately sacrificing soldiers for territory, grinding forward in anticipation of a new U.S. administration. The Kremlin likely expected that with a change in leadership, negotiations would follow, allowing them to leverage their battlefield gains at the bargaining table. The Russian economy, meanwhile, is in such a dire strait that even President Putin has expressed public concerns. Economic data from the Russian Federation is untrustworthy and manipulated for both propaganda purposes and to deny the West data that could help it more fine-tune the effects of their sanctions. What is known is that lending rates have reached as high as 21% as Russia's central bank fights runaway inflation, and the Russian economy has been mobilized for wartime production. Defense spending is propping up the Russian economy, and this is a big problem because war economies are inherently unstable. Instead of producing goods which can produce value in return, a wartime economy focuses on single-use items like weapons that produce no inherent value. Many analysts predict that Russia may not be able to afford to stop fighting, or if it does, it'll need immediate sanctions relief to avoid total economic collapse. Despite Kremlin assurances, Russia's once mighty cash reserves have been rapidly depleting. At this rate, most experts believe this country has less than a year before its economy hits a breaking point. Sanctions and the threat of U.S. retaliation have so far kept Russia from pressing the nuclear button. But in 2025, Moscow caught a massive break. The White House abruptly froze all aid to Ukraine and halted cyber operations against Russia. Although the Pentagon later denied this, the U.S. even backed Russia in the UN, while at the same time undermining Ukraine's ability to negotiate for peace. With American support for Ukraine and Europe fading fast, one question looms large. What would the U.S. do if Russia decided to strengthen its bargaining position by using a nuclear weapon, whether against Ukrainian forces or civilians? To try to guess what the White House might do, it helps to understand how it's been treating Russia generally since the change in administrations. A good indicator of how tolerant the U.S. is toward further Russian aggression is how the nation has approached negotiations over a peace settlement. Normally, during negotiations, a good strategy is to use as much leverage as possible and force your opponent to negotiate for concessions. That's why it's a good idea to not simply give anything away for free, no matter how small it may seem. Right off the bat, the White House announced it was freezing aid to Ukraine, giving up one of its biggest bargaining chips that it could have used in negotiations with Russia. Instead of using Ukraine aid as leverage, the U.S. gave it away for free, missing a chance to trade it for an equally valuable Russian concession. Such a move could have limited how much Russia ultimately gains from its invasion, while also reinforcing American and European security in the long run. Next, the U.S. announced that no U.S. troops would partake in any peacekeeping in case of a ceasefire deal. Yet again, another extremely valuable piece of leverage was simply discarded, even if internally it would have never been acceptable for American troops to help police a demilitarized border. A clever negotiator, or one truly committed to limiting Russia's gains, could have used the idea as a bargaining tool. By making Russia fight for a concession it was never going to get, the U.S. could have forced Moscow to trade away something of equal value. The U.S. further weakened its negotiating position with Russia by announcing that it did not recognize Ukrainian territorial integrity. But the biggest bombshell came when Washington announced it would no longer be a guarantor of European security. The White House's decision to hand Russia every bargaining chip it had speaks volumes about how it might respond to a Russian nuclear strike. In the past, the U.S. had not just threatened the use of military force, but it made it clear that it would seek further punishments. First, it would cut any remaining economic ties and rally global support for the end of the remaining links to Russia. Many Russian banks are still connected to the SWIFT international banking payment systems that facilitate global trade. And on March 17, 2025, the EU will be kicking out several more banks from SWIFT. These banks and more would have been removed in the event of an attack, further crippling Russia's ability to process payments for its oil and gas. Political pressure on the countries still trading with Russia would have escalated to secondary sanctions. These secondary sanctions could have been a powerful tool, pressuring countries like India and China to cut economic ties with Russia, severing the lifeline that has kept Moscow's war machine running. Further, to meet the Russian threat, the U.S. had pledged to open the floodgates on conventional military supplies to Ukraine. This would have included more ground combat vehicles, but specifically the long-range weapons that Ukraine had previously been denied or given very limited numbers of, with heavy restrictions attached. Weapons such as the F-16s and long-range missiles would have flown into Ukraine with restrictions for their use inside of Russia completely lifted. As far as the US was concerned, all bets would have been off in case of Russian nuclear use. However, by 2025, the US had done a complete 180 on its Ukraine policy. In a stunning reversal, it voted in favor of Russia at the UN, opposing any condemnation of the invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, all military and financial aid to Ukraine was frozen, effectively cutting Kyiv off from its most crucial lifeline. Instead, the US has offered a deal where it would take over half of Ukraine's remaining mineral wealth for itself, along with repayment for prior military aid given through grants. The deal, even when toned down after its initial offer, has been internationally labeled as a clear attempt to extort a desperate country, and it comes with no actual security guarantees for Ukraine. The tone and the mood of the United States toward Ukraine makes it clear that the former deterrents against nuclear use are likely gone. There's no indication that if Russia were to use a nuclear weapon today, that the White House would respond by punishing the nation so harshly it deters further use of nuclear weapons by anyone, anywhere in the world. America's abandonment of Ukraine has had the exact opposite effect of deterrence already, as even Iran's supreme leader has pointed out that negotiating with the US is pointless. This means that nations with nuclear weapons have no reason to give them up in future negotiations, after seeing how Ukraine was treated after giving up its own weapons. They also have no incentive to actually trust American deals aimed at reducing their nuclear stockpiles or getting rid of them altogether. Perhaps more worryingly, though, current events have informed nations like Iran that developing nuclear weapons means you can act however you like on the world stage against your neighbors. Every indication is that there would be no action by the United States for the use of nuclear weapons by Russia. But more importantly, Russia does not appear to need to use nuclear weapons any longer to achieve its goals. Europe is not ready to support Ukraine alone. Without several more years to expand its defense industry, European nations lack the military production capacity to replace lost US aid. At the same time, fear of a resurgent Russia has left many European countries prioritizing their own security over direct support for Ukraine. With defense stockpiles already depleted, leaders are hesitant to commit further, knowing that they may need those weapons for their own protection in the near future. Without US backing, Ukraine faces a rapidly shrinking support network, and Russia knows it. How do you think the US would respond if Russia used a nuclear weapon? Would it strike back, tighten sanctions, or try to de-escalate? And what would it mean for the rest of the world? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.